Charter Oak. He is the most generous, gracious, gentle man. He never says no to me, and we are just so delighted to have him here and so grateful. Chris Vials, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Donna, for the really generous introduction, and thanks to everyone for coming here tonight. I know you had a lot of things you could possibly be doing, but you chose to be here, and I really thank you and appreciate that. And thank you to Charter Oak and Alea for helping to set this up. But I wanted to, so most of my talk tonight is going to be walking through a PowerPoint presentation, but I'm going to talk a little bit at the, just a little bit at the beginning and at the end. But just to start out, I want to start with a disclaimer that I'm coming to the subject as someone whose expertise centers on fascism and the far right, both in the United States and Europe. And I'm coming to the topic I'm not coming to the topic as a specialist on Eastern Europe, though I have taught Soviet history in my classes. My talk comes from someone who studies fascism and the far right. And as someone who studies those things, Putin's invasion of Ukraine is deeply unsettling. And for many Americans, it's unsettling in a similar way that January 6th and the election of Donald Trump was unsettling. That is, these events are all part of a continuum and make us feel as if we're replaying a history of fascism and right-wing authoritarianism, a history that wasn't supposed to happen in the 21st century. In many ways, Trump in the United States, Putin in Russia, Duterte in the Philippines, Orban in Hungary, Bolsonaro in Brazil, Modi in India, and rising far-right movements around the world are all of a piece. But what makes Putin's invasion novel is that it's the first time we've seen in our 21st century brand of far-right authoritarianism on the march. That is, it's the first time we've seen this kind of far-right violence directed not just at domestic opponents and minoritized peoples within its borders, but projected outwards and on such a scale. An authoritarian strongman invading another sovereign country feels like the sequenced invasions leading up to World War II. And the good news, if there is good news, is that Putin's invasion is not going well. If we're going to do the analogy of World War II, it's as if, you know, Hitler invaded Poland and the Poles fought back and, you know, are quite effectively. But that invasion must fail so that we don't replay an earlier history of fascist world war. My talk tonight tries to address a number of questions, and I'm going to switch to a PowerPoint. Let's see. Okay. Well, maybe I should share this and not just see it on my own screen. Let's see. Okay. All right. Okay. So I hope everyone can see this. Right. Can just a thumbs up if you can see this. Okay. Thank you. All right. So driving questions here. How does Putin's invasion and the ideology behind it connect to a global history of fascism? Is Ukraine's fight a fight against global fascism? But also, how is the far right in the United States and around the world responding to the invasion? Do they see Putin's fight as their fight? Those are my main kind of two questions. But also, what do we need to know about the history of the Soviet Union in order to address these questions? And I'm not doing an exhaustive history, but just a few details about World War II that are significant for understanding the current conflict. It's important to start out, if we're talking about this from the perspective of a kind of a global fascism, is that the war is ostensibly being kind of fought on anti-fascist grounds from Putin. You know, Putin will say, you know, this is from his speech on the eve of the invasion, focused on their own goals, the leading NATO countries are supporting the far-right nationalists and neo-Nazis in Ukraine, those who will never forgive the people of Crimea and Sevastopol for freely making a choice to reunite with Russia. They will undoubtedly try to bring war to Crimea, just as they've done to the Donbass, to kill innocent people as members of the punitive units and nationalists and Hitler's accomplices did during the Great War. And I should say here too is that Putin's, if you read English translations of his speeches on the Kremlin's website, and he almost never fails to mention the Second World War in a speech. And particularly the fight against the Nazis in World War II. I even read something, he was making an address to Aeroflot flight attendants, and he somehow brought in the Great Patriotic War, right? So this is being launched in ostensibly anti-fascist terms by Russia, and Russia announced that it will hold that's this upcoming August the first international anti-fascist conference to fight Nazism. And he's invited heads of state to this who have aligned with him. He's invited Kazakhstan, Ethiopia, Saudi Arabia, China, India, Pakistan, Uzbekistan, Azerbaijan, mostly his allies who have failed to kind of critique the war. But interestingly, I've not met any kind of anti-fascist scholar who's been invited to this conference. So again, war is being lodged by Russia on ostensibly anti-fascist grounds. Now, Ukraine, for its own part, will also do this, right? And I'm not trying to engage whataboutism here. So Zelensky said the other day when he was addressing the Israeli Knesset, they tell you that we're Nazis, but how can a people that lost 8 million lives to defeat the Nazis support Nazism? How can I be a Nazi? Say it to my grandfather who fought in World War II as a Soviet infantryman and had died in a colonel in independent Ukraine. Now, there's a reason that everybody from that region is accessing the Second World War in this fight for obvious reasons, but I don't think that Americans realize most people in America, the United States, realize the extent of this history. World War II in American memory is framed by Pearl Harbor and D-Day, basically an unprovoked attack and a liberation, with the kind of the happy story really beginning, if we want to call a happy story, with the invasion of Normandy, which is seen as kind of the turning point. But keep in mind that in the history of the war, 75% of German casualties and equipment losses in World War II were on the Eastern Front. If you talk to people in Germany, whose grandfathers fought in the war, it's usually, or their parents fought in the war, they almost always fought in Russia, died in Russia, were captured in Russia, as they'll say. It should be the Soviet Union, but we'll say this Russia. But also 25 to 27 million Soviet citizens died in the Second World War. 18 million of those are civilians, okay? That is by far the largest death toll of any nation in World War II. The only one that comes closest to that is China, with around 15 million dead, as we're kind of starting to see now. But the United States loses 400,000 people in this war, to put this in perspective. Also, something kind of basic about the Soviet Union, just to keep in mind here, and this continues into most all the post-Soviet states, is the sheer kind of ethnic and ethno-racial diversity of the Soviet state, and also kind of later states that followed from it, but more so the Soviet state. Where that you have kind of a range of people. I know this might sound basic if you're more familiar with the geography, but Russians and Ukrainians and the peoples of this peoples of the former Soviet Union or the Soviet Union did not all read as Europeans, right, by any stretch. And in fact, this is part of the Nazi justification for the war, was the very multi-ethnic nature and the multiracial nature of the Soviet state. With this invasion of the Soviet Union, which begins in June 22nd, Operation Barbarossa, where Germany invades the Soviet Union. Germany and its allies invaded on three main fronts. They invaded with 3 million troops in an invasion force, which consisted of 2 million Germans and 1 million from its allies, Austria, Italy, Hungary, Romania, Finland, and Slovakia. And this map here is not really, doesn't break it down by state, but by September of that year, they've taken all of Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltic states, and some of Russia itself. So within months, Germany and its allies had basically occupied all of Ukraine, all of Belarus, all the Baltic states, and were stopped just outside of kind of Leningrad and Moscow, which they never took. While that might seem, if you look at the larger map of the Soviet Union, it might not read as that much. It might territorially not look like they got very far, but keep in mind that the area they occupied represented 45% of the Soviet population, 2/3 of Soviet manufacturing, and 40% of the Soviet food supply. Then as now, Ukraine was the breadbasket of the Soviet Union. Its loss was catastrophic for that country, and they had to import a lot of their foods through the United States through the Lend-Lease Act to kind of make up for this loss. But this is also something to keep in mind, is that at that point in the war, Germany had already had 750,000 casualties by December. And in military terms, we say casualties, we mean dead plus wounded. But if you think of it, and that's compared to 156,000 from all of their Western blitzkriegs up to that point. But if you think about that in, like modern terms, that's striking. That means they've lost like 750,000 troops when they're winning, right? So this was something that was clearly unsustainable, right? But going forward here, and I'm going into this history of the war just because a kind of a general refresher, because it's something that's accessed constantly in the current conflict. And it's also worth noting that Kyiv has been destroyed before. This is Kyiv in July 23rd, 1941, the day after, or June 23rd, I'm sorry, right after the Nazi invasion. The Germans leveled cities in their wake, particularly in the Soviet Union. Minsk as well. The Nazi occupation was most brutal in Belarus and Ukraine. And this famous, I didn't realize until this invasion that this famous photo of the grieving women with the bomb damage behind them, that is from the outskirts of Kyiv. Now, what justified this, and to access the kind of history of fascism here, that both Ukraine and Russia are kind of living in the aftermath of, the Nazi doctrine that was used to kill 25 million people, at least, was Lebensraum. And what this basically means is it's a German word it's a German compound that means living space. Lebensraum was basically Nazi settler colonialism, and it's also the reason why the invasion and the occupation was so horrific, in the sense that what they did is they wanted to eliminate all the peoples that were in their way in the Soviet Union and replace them with German small farmers. It was akin to what the North Americans did to indigenous peoples in North America. So what you kind of see in this, and also they were explicitly talking about, the Nazis were explicitly talking about the Ukrainians as Indians. They were accessing American Westerns literally as they were kind of going in and occupying the Ukraine, which was seen at the time as the kind of crown jewel of the Soviet Union. Hitler had written, "I need the Ukraine in order that no one is able to starve us again, like in the last war. The conquest of Ukraine would ensure a way of life for our people through the allocation of Lebensraum for the next 100 years." Right. So then and now there was the idea that if you just occupied Ukraine, you could feed your kind of the Aryan folk for a millennium. And I did see a UN expert talking about basically the soil in Ukraine is still rich enough, and it's still exports something like 15% of the world's wheat, and the agricultural produce of the country today can still feed 400 million people around the world, right? So this was seen as kind of a crown to occupy during war by Hitler. But also in Nazi racial theory, the Soviet people were European Asian hybrids, and such had to be destroyed. If you're familiar with Nazi racial theory, you're familiar with the idea that any kind of hybrid person of mixed racial descent is a monstrosity, right? And so by definition, the multi-ethnic nature of the Soviet state made it a monstrosity and its people eligible for destruction, right? So last thing about kind of ancient history here, Barbarossa and Holocaust history. Keep in mind that the Nazis truly began the Holocaust not immediately after they took power in 1933, nor at the beginning of the war in Europe in 1939, but really it gets underway after the invasion of the Soviet Union in mid-1941 and in occupied territories of the East. Behind kind of deep in their occupied territories of Belarus and Ukraine and Russia and Poland, this is where they began the techniques of mass extermination. And so Hitler thought that if he killed Soviet Jews, the USSR would immediately fall apart, since Jews were supposedly the puppet masters of the Soviet state. You might be familiar with this, but the whole idea of the Judeo-Bolshevik myth, the Judeo-Bolshevik myth, the idea that basically Jews and communists are the same thing, was pervasive across Europe in the early 20th century. It was a guiding logic of anti-Semitism, and it was a guiding logic behind the invasion of the Soviet Union. You could kind of kill like the head of Jewish power in Hitler's idea by destroying basically the Soviet Union. Now, also to keep in mind, from June to December 1941, the Nazis had already murdered 500,000 Jews in occupied USSR, mostly through mass shootings or gas bans. So this was before they even set up the system of mass extermination at Auschwitz and other death camps, before they had fully established the death camp system. 100,000 were murdered at Babi Yar in Ukraine already, and over the course of the occupation, but also the 100,000, or at least in that first 6 months of the war, 100,000 are killed at Babi Yar. This is the same memorial that's in Kyiv. It's a site in Kyiv that was shelled by the Russians the other day. Now, this last bit of the war, Operation Bagration, basically, this is the liberation of the territories. And so in this, it was the Soviets basically sent Ukrainian divisions to reoccupy Ukraine, Belarusian divisions to reoccupy Belarus, etc. And this was a war effort that was sometimes called the D-Day of the East, in which it was just as large and involved just as many troops, if not more, than the Normandy invasion in the West that was simultaneous with it, right? So, okay, this is the history of the war, and just if we're on Soviet history, something else here that's important to know and to contextualize the current situation. Now, the body counts and the death figures for the Stalinist regime really vary, and it's very politicized. One of the what I found the better sources was an academic study by J. Archgetty and Roberta Manning that came out in 1993. And that might sound old, but 1993 is important because it was a moment when the Soviet archives opened up. It was this brief window of time in the first half of the 90s when scholars could really go in almost as an open book to read, the Soviet archives before Putin basically shut it down, right? But from what they found in the archive during that time is that if you're going to talk about the mass deaths, most of the deaths of the Stalin period, and keep in mind that the Stalin period is the most brutal in Soviet history. It's when most of the atrocities in Soviet history take place. You basically have the Holodomor, I could be mispronouncing this, 5 to 8 million dead from a famine, mostly in Ukraine. What they did was that they tried to basically they collectivized the agriculture and strangely kind of destroyed this very collectivist village system that was in place before, and sucked up all of the surplus, all of the kind of surplus grain to feed the cities and kind of rapidly industrialize. But when there is, basically a drought and a crop failure and bad weather, there's no reserves, people die in masses, right? So this is mostly happening, but not entirely happening in Ukraine. Then you have the Gulag system with 1 to 1.5 million dead. And then you have direct executions, which are around 200,000 plus, right? And so the death from this period is again concentrated disproportionately in Ukraine. So this is Ukraine not only bears the mark of one of the kind of Ukraine not only kind of suffers disproportionately from the Nazi invasion, but also suffers earlier from kind of Stalin's mass collectivizations disproportionately. Now, shifting gears here, why is the transatlantic right kind of so in love with Putin? And what I didn't realize the extent to which, until fairly recently, that Putin was openly relying on fascist thinkers, whether we're talking about Alexander Dugin, Ivan Ilyich, or Alexander Prokhanov. I'm not going to talk about all of these in detail, but I will talk about a couple of them because he's actually getting his rationale from the invasion from these thinkers, particularly Dugin and Ilyich. Ilyich even more so. And strikingly, they are open fascists, right? So I will say, first of all, that to contextualize this is that we're thinking about broadly the political right much more kind of expansively, right? There's a split. And according to kind of political scientist Corey Robbins in The Reactionary Mind, the right is split between those who are drawn to the figure of the businessman and those who are drawn to the figure of the warrior, right? So some on the right are more drawn to kind of capitalism, to corporations, to the free market, and see kind of liberation in the free market and big business and all these other things, or even small business. But then there are others on the right who are more drawn to kind of warrior values, warrior virtues. Not that those two things, the businessman and the warrior, never meet, but you can see based on one's animating passions what strand of the right they fall on. And if we're talking about the history of fascism, we're talking about those on the right who are more drawn to the warrior and the cult of the warrior and the figure of the warrior more so than the businessman. Now, just a working definition of fascism too, very quickly here, is that unlike conservatism, fascism is not primarily driven by traditional elites who want to preserve their economic interests, nor is it interested in capitalism or economics. So the business, economics, tax breaks, capitalism, this just bores fascists. They're neither for or against it necessarily. It's just boring. It's not their driving passion. They're not that particular strand of the right. Their animating passions are militarism, cult of the warrior, that's a masculinist fetish of action, anti-Marxism, and a violent and racist and authoritarian drive for national rebirth, right? That's what drives fascists and the fascist wing of the right, not capitalism or economics, etc. Unlike conservatism, fascism tends to be led and supported by the middle classes. And while there's only been a handful of fascist states in history, Germany, Italy, Japan, certainly, Spain is disputed by scholars, fascist movements and currents exist in almost every country in the world, right? So we've only had a few fascist states, but virtually every country, including the United States, has had fascist movements and currents. And sometimes, even if they don't take state power, they can do a hell of a lot of damage, including in the United States in its history. Now, with that in mind, people are aware of kind of the warrior ethos or the machismo ethos that Putin cultivates, right? And that alone is not kind of a symptom of fascist ethos, but it's also not a good sign, right? But also it's important to note that in dictators in the past, Mussolini also loved posing shirtless, right? This is something that's kind of forgotten about Mussolini. He had a kind of a photo series done in the mid-1920s, one where he was draining the Pontine marshes, draining the swamp, as it were. It was a symbolic anti-corruption campaign. But he loved being photographed shirtless, mainly because it symbolized the warrior virility that was essential to kind of fascism, right? Going forward here, though, is that you could see that that I will say it's important, but it's not enough to kind of, that's not the main link I'm making, but it's worth noting. But you have in some of Putin's puppets and what he's kind of funded around the world, some even more sinister and more overtly, directly fascist figures. Now, Razman Khadirov, who he basically put in as head of the Chechen republics after the two wars there in the 90s, basically Chechnya became kind of a Russian satellite. They tried to do well, they were part of Russia, they still are part of Russia. They tried to declare independence, they kind of crushed that. But the person that Putin put in charge, Khadirov, basically is been kind of denounced all around the world for persecuting, torturing GLBTQ folks, and literally murdering gays and lesbians in his country. But he's also, really cultivates this, this cult of tradition, this cult of the warrior. He's fond of dressing up. This is at one of his birthday celebrations, dressing up in the kind of the garb of medieval Chechnya. He loves posing with guns, the bigger the better. He loves jet skis. He loves working out. He loves wrestling with tigers. But all of these things are also these kind of really seemingly just idiotic symbols of masculinity are also kind of central to gauging the spirit of fascism and the essence of fascism, as ridiculous as they seem. What you have consistently is basically, and what's kind of, Putin has helped to establish in some of his satellites, is a kind of cult of the warrior, of ridiculous machismo that's tied to authoritarian repression, that's also tied specifically to going after minoritized communities that are traditionally marginalized in their territories, right? So it's not, in Kadirov's case, it's not the Jews per se, it's not the Roma, but it is gays and lesbians who will kind of other in very similar terms as the antithesis of his own kind of warrior masculinity. Now, but there's deeper influences here, more intellectual influences, and Putin is, by and large, an intellectual also. So one of the figures that he is kind of indirectly channeling, Putin is the German legal scholar Karl Schmidt and his theory of Großraum, or big space. Now, Karl Schmidt was a literal Nazi, right? He was a Nazi jurist. He was a member of the Nazi Party. He supported Adolf Hitler, and he called, the Nuremberg trials, victor's justice, and very much opposed those. He was very much a Nazi, right? And he's animating a lot of political theory on the right now globally, including Putin's. Now, what Schmidt formulated was this theory of Großraum from 1939 to 41. It was briefly used by the Nazis to justify their expansion in the East. And now Putin is actually using it in its recycled version to do his own expansions, right? What this theory basically holds is it puts forward this idea of a Großraum, right? This is, in Schmidt's theory, a Großraum is basically, it means big space. And what this big space has is it has a Reich in its center, and Schmidt insisted on the untranslatability of that German word, but it has a Reich at its center, and it's a political space with one coherent idea in its center that radiates outwards through all its territories and all its protectorates. And basically what it is, it symbolizes, the Reich itself symbolizes a people that's awake to their national identity, and it's completely sovereign. This Reich and its territories are completely sovereign. They're completely untouched and untouchable by other powers, right? So but in Schmidt's idea, an ideal Reich contains, at that center of the circle, contains an ethnically homogeneous folk with clusters of ethnically homogeneous peoples in its big space, right? So what he was trying to put forward, for example, here was an idea of world order in which there would be a German Reich at the head of all of Europe, animated by a fascist idea of an ethnically homogeneous people, imagined on fascist lines. And it would command a Europe in which you had all these other clusters of ethnic homogeneous people in its territories too. You had an ethnically homogeneous Romania, ethnically homogeneous France, ethnically homogeneous Italy, none of whom would have Jews, all of whom would have kind of a unitary idea, a fascist idea, even though they wouldn't be incorporated into the Reich. Now, so what he put forward also is that there wouldn't just be one Reich in the world. There wouldn't be just one Großraum. There would be several. There would be a bunch. And there'd be a principle of non-interference where one wouldn't touch the other. And so he theorized that the United States had long been operating its own Reich, its own Großraum, through the Monroe Doctrine, where its kind of like idea of liberal democracy was its center, and it kind of commanded this idea over Latin America specifically, right? So this is the idea of the Großraum. It's theorized by, again, Karl Schmidt, a Nazi theorist. And you started to see bits of this, as I wrote elsewhere, you started to see bits of this idea coming up in Trump's speeches to the UN General Assembly that were penned by, what's his name? Stephen Miller. Sorry, I forgot his name already. But going forward, so you have this idea of Großraum that's being channeled here. And what's, although the idea of Lebensraum was actually closer to Nazi practice, but what Alexander Dugin does is he popularizes that idea for Putin and puts it in Russian terms. So what Dugin does, first of all, he works Schmidt's theory into a theory of Russian imperial power called Eurasianism. And he popularizes this idea of Eurasia within Russia. And if its symbols here are the 8 arrows. This is the 8 arrows of Eurasianism. So this is supposed to be kind of a Großraum in the middle of here, and it's kind of radiating outwards. So what he's kind of putting forward, and I should say here that Dugin's book, The Fourth Political Theory, based on Schmidt, was required reading for Russian generals for a time. And Dugin was in Putin's circle, and he was kind of even nicknamed Putin's Rasputin, for a time when he was in there because of his, his Russian Orthodox kind of fanaticism and his kind of monkish appearance. But all of these things, so this is what he is putting forth as a devout follower of the Russian Orthodox Church is an anti-democratic view that wants a destruction of the Western liberal modern world. And what he wants in its place, and this is at the center of his circle, the center of his idea of Großraum, is he wants a renewed society based on patriarchal blood and soil communities ruled by warrior priests. Sounds reasonable enough. I'm kidding, you can't necessarily see me. But that's his kind of Großraum concept, right? Is that in the middle of that circle is this Russia ruled on this principle, patriarchal blood and soul communities ruled by warrior priests. And it has all of these other clusters like Ukraine and Latvia, Lithuania, maybe Poland, that are run out of that same basis, but are not technically incorporated into Russia, right? That's theory was animating and has been animating Vladimir Putin, right? At least in part. And I should say, of course, he's appeared on Alex Jones's InfoWars, and his books have been translated into English by Arctos Press, which is a kind of alt-right press. He's kind of Dugin's views are circulated outside of Russia pretty extensively. Richard Spencer's Russian-born wife was also translating some of his work into English. And so he was also, Dugin appeared at a Zoom talk at Texas A&M University, right? It's sponsored by kind of Texas right-wingers too, right? So he's made it into this country as well. Now, interestingly enough, he loses his position in 2014 as the department head of sociology at Moscow University after calling for the mass murder of Ukrainians, right? So at that point, he was just seen as kind of too toxic even for Putin. He was just embarrassing Putin. He had to be kind of put out to pasture, right? So Putin was not, kind of quoting him as much anymore. One of the things that should be noted, though, is that Putin is envisioning this whole thing as what his kind of image is kind of an ethno-state, right? That is also along the lines of white nationalist theory derived from Schmidt. So Vladimir Putin writes these articles, oftentimes these academic-like articles. So he writes an article last year on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians, and he writes, and this is something that's apparently being taught to Russian school kids now too. Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians are all descendants of ancient Rus, which was the largest state in Europe. Slavic and other tribes across the vast territory from Ladoga, Novograd, Pskov, Kiev, Chernigov were bound together by one language, economic ties, the rule of the princes of the Ruhr dynasty, and after the baptism of Rus, the Orthodox faith. The spiritual choice made by Saint Vladimir, who was born, who was both Prince of Novgorod and Grand Prince of Kiev, as they would say in Russian, still largely determines our affinity today. The throne of Kiev had held a dominant position in ancient Rus. This had been the custom since the 9th century. The tale of bygone years captured for posterity the words of Oleg the prophet about Kiev, let it be the mother of all Russian cities, right? So you see this kind of ethno-nationalist desire for kind of an ethnically based empire that reappears in his writings, that is also in the family tree of fascism for sure. And this notion that Russians, Ukrainians, Belarusians, they might not they might share a blood, but they also at the very least share a common culture, and they really are not separate peoples, right? That they actually, so this notion is very much at the center of the war effort and its kind of rationale for the war. Now, the figure that Putin channels much more than Dugin, much more consistently, is another person named Ivan Ilyich, right, who lives from 1883 to 1954. He's the Russian philosopher who crafted what Timothy Schneider called Christian fascism. He wrote 20 books in Russian, 20 in German. He was quite prolific. During the Russian Civil War, this is right after the Bolshevik Revolution, he provided a philosophy of the whites. So the whites are the folks who are fighting the Reds. They're the kind of counter-revolutionary forces. He has to flee the Soviet Union in 1922 after the Bolsheviks win, and he lives the rest of his life in exile, mostly in Germany. He eagerly embraced Mussolini in 1922, then Adolf Hitler. Apparently he was quite ashamed that the Italians had to invent fascism and not the Russians, right? He was even wondering, why couldn't we have done that? So it's important in this note that Putin was so drawn to this guy that he organized for his remains to be reinterred in a sacred site in Moscow, the Donskoy Monastery in Moscow. So, Putin is also kind of often seen at Russian Orthodox churches. He's a big supporter of the Russian Orthodox Church, and they're a big supporter of him, right? So he's sacralized and kind of beatified this person. Now, in terms of his philosophy, Ilyich believed that spirit, or duk, was the basis of the nation and not the rule of law. To him, fascists recognize that you have something more profound than the rule of law. You have a spirit, right? And that has to be channeled through a kind of a leader that is not bound by rules. He believed that bold actions by exceptional leader who embodied Duke's spirit could cure the malaise of existence, but his preference was for a Russian Orthodox monarch, though he thought, okay, well, a secular fascist will do for the time being, but his preference is for a monarch. Democracies to him did nothing to stop Bolshevism, so they had to be destroyed and replaced by a theocratic authoritarian empire. Again, warrior priests, we get this kind of idea from him as well, from Ilyich. He's anti-Semitic, much like Hitler, and anti-Semites everywhere believed that Jews were responsible for communism. So he also channeled the Judeo-Bolshevik myth that I mentioned earlier. He also believed that the peoples which composed Russia were part of a single living organism under a Russian head, and he would use Ukraine in quotation marks because it was part of that organism. So Ukraine needed to be used in quotation marks because just to index that it's a thing out there, but not that he thought was an organic entity that needed to be preserved. He didn't really acknowledge its independent existence, right? He also believed in this thing called Eurasia, right? So this is, again, the person who Putin has consistently kind of drawn on to formulate his theory of world power, right? Now, I should note here, though, and I'm getting kind of close to the end here, that despite what I've said about kind of fascist movements in Russia, there is in fact a problem in Ukraine too. And this is not a whataboutism. This is not to say, I don't support Ukraine. But we do have to kind of be not blindsided by this, that, before all of this, at least it was under, it was kind of on the decline, but Ukraine had the Svoboda Party, which I'm probably mispronouncing, a Freedom Party, which was founded in 1991 as a more or less explicitly fascist party. And it peaked in 2012 with 10% of the national vote, right? And this is a more or less an explicitly kind of fascist party, at least from its outset, and it got a little bit more tame. But interestingly enough, the kind of pro-fascist party vote was strongest in Western Ukraine, particularly around the Lviv area, where it's getting close to 40% of the vote and almost none of the vote in kind of Eastern Ukraine, right? It declines after that. So, and Jason Stanley notes this in a recent article, that they only get 2% of the vote in 2019. So that movement was really on the decline massively at the point of the invasion, right? And it's, at 2% of the vote, there are many countries that have much bigger fascist problems than Ukraine based on that, right? But, Ukraine still does have its fascist militias and its currents in Ukraine. Sorry, I left this thing at the bottom. The Azov Battalion, which has been fighting the Russians in the Donbass region since 2014. It uses the Wulfangel rune, which is basically recognized as a neo-Nazi symbol everywhere. It's the rune that was used by the 2nd Panzer Division of the SS during World War II. So they have very distinctly Nazi overtones, and they're part of the they've been like incorporated into the Ukrainian National Guard, right? So they've been receiving state funding for a while. This is not to say that Putin's rhetoric of that they're riddled with Nazis is correct. He's using this as a pretext. His own country, as I'll mention, also uses kind of fascist militias too. This is not the reason he's invading, right? But there's also in Ukraine, there's a cult of Stepan Bandera. Bandera was this Ukrainian nationalist leader who was basically assassinated by the KGB in Munich in the 50s. But he was basically a Nazi collaborator who, when the Nazis invaded, welcomed them in open arms and only had a falling out with the Nazis when they kind of differed on the administration of Ukraine. He wanted Ukraine to be an independent state. They wanted it to just be part of the German Reich. So they did put him in a concentration camp, but he was a full-throated fascist who was also deeply anti-Semitic, believed in the Judeo-Bolshevik myth, deeply controversial in Ukraine, and ironically and sadly is very popular in the western part of the country. And in 2018, the Ukrainian parliament made his birthday a national holiday, right? So I'm saying this again, not to somehow confirm Putin's rhetoric, because Putin is also channeling fascism in a lot of ways. But Zelensky himself is struggling with these elements of his own country. And I do fear that these elements will be strengthened through the course of the war effort, right? Russian fascist paramilitaries, just again, getting towards the end here. Again, just to be clear, also use them. The Wagner Group is one of the worst. They're the private mercenary army run by one of Putin's oligarch friends, 6,000 members. They're basically the kind of the Blackwater of Russia. They're named after Richard Wagner, and its founder was covered with Nazi tattoos. They're scary because they have serious combat experience in the Donbass, Central African Republic, Libya, Syria. In the early days of the current war, this has not gotten a lot of play. This has just started to come out. This neo-Nazi militia or mercenary army tried to assassinate Zelensky 3 times and failed. There's some speculation that they were tipped off by, the Ukrainians were tipped off by pro-Ukrainian elements, or at least anti-war elements within the Russian Secret Service. So my last 2 slides here about the war in Ukraine and the global far right. So before the February 2022 invasion of Ukraine, Russia has been providing financial and media support to far-right parties across Europe since 2013. West Europeans on the far right hate communism, but ironically see it as having saved Eastern Europe from American liberalism, multiculturalism, and consumerism. So they see it as a lot of West Europeans on the far right see Eastern Europe as this kind of haven for identity-starved whites, right? That, you know, they've been preserved from multiculturalism, ironically, cocooned from it by behind the Iron Curtain. In the US, Trump abandoned Cold War institutions and foreign policy assumptions for his America First policy, which cleared the ground for friendly relationships with Putin all over the map, very much emboldened him. And the white nationalist right in the like the US, mostly Republicans, kind of followed suit there. But after the February 22 invasion of Ukraine, what's striking is that I've been monitoring this very closely, just vast confusion on the US right and in the European right about who to side with in this invasion, right? The far right authoritarian politicians and heads of state outside the USSR are kind of walking this tightrope. And you'll see headlines like, okay, Bolsonaro or Modi refuses to condemn Putin for the invasion, but also, you know, refuses to kind of like support him either. So they're trying to stay as quiet as possible. Before, these are all folks who were very chummy with Putin. Now it's seeming like politically toxic. They seem to be kind of privately supportive of him, but not willing to kind of put that on the line. The dominant conservative narrative in the United States is that Putin's invasion of Ukraine would have never happened under Trump, and it's a sign of Biden's weakness. And so what you see in the United States, this narrative is not necessarily a fascist narrative. It's basically this kind of older baby boomer Cold War narrative of American leadership and how kind of Biden has, you know, walked away from that. But it also still marks a shift away from America First. So, but I will say most American conservatives seem to be supporting Ukraine, right? And it's a kind of a minority that kind of supports Russia in this. But there is a smaller core of the American right that is pro-Putin directly or indirectly. That includes Tucker Carlson, Alex Jones, Lauren Boebert, Marjorie Taylor Greene. Tucker Carlson and Alex Jones are not there, you know, extreme, but they're not also to be written off. Both of them have massive followings. Tucker Carlson has the highest rated cable news show on television right now, and it's followed by a surprising number of young Democrats too, right? So these are not just random folks. The neo-Nazi fringe is split between Putin and Ukrainian loyalties in the sense that like if I've gone to like as part of my kind of work, I monitor these groups, but I've looked at the Stormfront website, which is the big American neo-Nazi website. They seem to be having a debate about who do they support, Putin or Ukraine, right? And with some of the anti-Putin folks saying like, well, he's just starting a white-on-white war, right? It's interesting to note that most Europeans on the far right are volunteering as foreign fighters for Ukraine, not Russia. And because they see Russia as kind of communist and Eurasian, right? What to do with this is, you know, up to us. But suffice to say that the right is, whereas most all of the world is against Putin on this, the right is at least confused on it. They're not sure who to support or not. And this is my final note. Donald Trump, in an interview right after the invasion, said, "So Putin is now saying it's independent, a large section of Ukraine." I said, "How smart is that? And he's going to go in and be a peacekeeper. That's the strongest peace force. We could use that on our southern border. There were more army tanks than I've ever seen." Now he's kind of walked back statements like this since then, but it's worth saying that like many statements from the former president, this makes no sense on the face of it. But somehow it also crystallizes the worldview of the transatlantic far right. The thing that links Putin's border crossing with the Trumpian border wall isn't just a literal deployment of troops. Rather, it's a weaponized masculinity that leaps to the defense of race, ethnicity, and nation. And for Putin, as for Trump, Violence, whether at home or abroad, is crucial to sovereignty and national renewal. Even if it so isolates you that you need a whole new concept of world order to wrap your head around it and make it stick. In their view, innocents on their border will always represent threats to be destroyed. So thank you.
Wow. Thank you, Chris. That was a very powerful and enlightening presentation. It was feel like we need like a moment of silence to absorb it and reorient ourselves. Would anyone, we have 50 people, so I think what we're going to do is if you have a question, could you write it in the chat? And we'll try to get to as many as we can. And while you're doing that, I just want to say that I want to invite you again to Thursday night's discussion about nurturing our humanity, because it really talks about all the things that are the underpinning of fascism and how to undo that and how to fight that and how to create a different kind of world than this, that this kind of world is not inevitable. And if you feel kind of hopeless tonight, I think the discussion on Thursday night will make you feel a little bit more hopeful. And they're a wonderful complement to one another. Question for Chris. This is from Jerry Phillips. What about NATO's role in the Russia-Ukraine conflict?
Do you mind just elaborating?
Yeah, Jerry, you want to say a little bit more about that? What do you think NATO's role should be, or?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, the question is that, you know, at the collapse of the Soviet Union, the sort of unspoken agreement was that the NATO would not expand eastward if Germany was integrated into the NATO alliance. Germany was integrated into the NATO alliance, and the United States and NATO have expanded eastward. So, you know, right up to with, you know, missiles and all the rest of it in Poland and Ukraine. That's been the issue, right? That whether Ukraine would be admitted into the NATO alliance. So, can you speak to that issue, that which Russia considers Ukraine part of its sphere of influence, and you know, there's a concern with Russian national security. Do you think that this is a legitimate concern?
Is it a legitimate concern? Sure. Is it something that you invade another country for? No. I mean, I guess that's my kind of short answer, is that yes. But I would also say that kind of the history of violence that I kind of covered earlier in the talk with the Second World War has created a somewhat of almost a paranoid foreign policy. But it's important to know that war affected Ukraine and Belarus just as much. So if we're talking about kind of a rationally based paranoia about kind of enemies expanding on your borders, yes, there is a rational basis for that, but at the same time, again, it's just not. There's no justifying kind of an invasion, I think, of someone else's sovereignty based on that fear and anxiety. So.
Thank you, Jerry. We have a question here from May. How closely do Putin's in Russia allies support his crusade? If not closely, can we hope that they will work for his removal so that business as usual might return?
Well, yeah, this is where I'm going to say I'm not kind of an expert in this, but what is becoming more clear in recent days is kind of, sadly, a lot of folks in Russia do support this. And it seems like there's regional variations, there's kind of town country variations. I've had some reports from folks in Moscow where they say younger people in Moscow, no one supports it. But if Gallup polls or whatever polling is to believe, it might be might be talking 70% of the population supports it, right? But again, I'm not going to say that with certainty because I don't know. But I will say, the good news in this is that, and I hope I didn't leave people feeling hopeless, because the second part of this question about working for his removal is that the sanctions do seem to be working to an extent. And when he's lost 10,000 troops so far, Putin has lost 10,000 troops. That's a tremendous human tragedy. But at the same time, it's not going well for him. And I don't see how this is going to go well for him. And so I don't want to, I'm bringing up fascism because it's what I study and I think it's there, but I'm right now not seeing a replay of World War II. As I said in the beginning, if we're going to use that analogy, it's like the invasion of Poland has just gotten bogged down and it's not going well, right? So I don't see this kind of continuing outwards, and it needs to be bogged down in Ukraine so it doesn't actually become some kind of global dynamic.
Anybody else have a question? I have a question.
I had a question. I just
Sure,
put
go
it
ahead,
in the
Lorraine.
chat box. I was wondering, is China's role crucial to NATO in the war between Russia and Ukraine? And with total commitment to NATO, how will Russia react?
Yeah, I mean, it's again, it seems to me as if China, from what I'm kind of read about the unfolding situation, and on that front, you might know as much about that as I do, is that China is also kind of walking this back somewhat. They're in that kind of like cluster of powers that's refusing to condemn the invasion, is trying to kind of play both sides a little bit. But it was also, China is much more invested and less sanction proof than other countries, right? It's much more invested in world trade than is Russia. Russia has been trying to build this sanction proof economy for a long time, and that also doesn't seem to be working. But China is, I think, would be a willing partner in this Eurasia thing if that invasion went well and if he wasn't a global pariah. But given that it's not going well, and given that there seems to be a social cost for allying with Putin, they seem to have gotten a little bit more cautious about openly embracing Putin, and that's a very good thing. That's a very good news. So I think I think China, if they got on board with this whole kind of foreign invasion shtick, they'd be a lot more frightening than Russia, right? And they have a lot more capacity than Russia. But that said, I think, that's another sign of perhaps good news, is that they seem to be trying to back away from this a little bit.
And if they publicly denounced the invasion in Ukraine, how do you think Russia would react to that, considering the Article 5 for the US and NATO, and then Russia capitulating and saying, yes, okay, we are with NATO and, the Article 5. How do you think Russia would react? Would you perceive they would use chemical weapons or biological weapons? How do you think or nuclear? It's one of the things I think that is really concerning to the Western nations. How do you think Russia would react to that?
I mean, it's outside of my area of expertise, but I don't see them using chemical weapons in reaction to China backing away, right? I think that makes them, sure, more desperate in certain ways, but I don't see some kind of one-on-one relationship where China says, okay, we're not going to support you, and so we're going to use chemical weapons. But because they're already starting to feel that kind of isolation, even from China, somewhat. So, I see another comment. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
We have a question from Sarah. I saw an opinion piece that this conflict spells the demise of the international alt-right, since Putin has been so discredited by this invasion. I was wondering if you would agree with that. Will it be the demise, or just choose a different spiritual leader?
That's a great question. Yeah, that's a really, really great question. Off the top of my head, as I said in the presentation, the international right is confused. they seem to be, in the United States, they seem that kind of white nationalist American first view of the world seems to be discredited through this too, and through this relationship with Putin. And more and more Republicans are kind of breaking with Trump, at least on kind of his Putin stance. But it's just thrown kind of disarray and confusion into that international alt-right movement. And so, yeah, I don't think this is helping the international far right one tiny bit. I think this represents kind of a crisis for them, and you can see that in their own internal debates. And it's striking when you look at, because one of the papers I look at is Junge Freiheit, which is the paper of the kind of the far right party in Germany, the AfD. It's striking how little they cover the war, right? And it's like Breitbart in the United States. If you look at that site, which is our big kind of white nationalist site over here, it's striking how little coverage they give to this, because they just know it's upsetting to their members. They don't know what to do with it. They want it to go away. So that's the kind of positive thing. But the reason I mention this stuff about Ukrainian fascists too is because I do worry a little bit that this is going to amplify domestically a kind of a fascist problem within that country. And I do worry about the combat experience, quite frankly, that fascists on all sides of this conflict are getting, right? So whereas I don't see this helping them ideologically, this is a movement that speaks with force, and they're getting major combat experience from this. And that's worrying to me. But yes, you're right. Like, this is not good for them.
We have another question about, do you have any sense of when the US might enter this war on moral grounds?
I'm not seeing that happening. I don't. And unless he kind of goes into Poland, which I don't think he's any kind of in a condition to do. But what's striking about that analog, and I keep going back to World War II on this, is that before World War II, most of the American public was split on even whether it was going to do sanctions. So if you look to say 1940, 1939, when the war was in Asia and Europe was very much heated up already, there was a universal rejection of the idea of sending American troops to fight, right, across the political spectrum. But even then, the big debate was, the left was saying we need to send economic sanctions or do economic sanctions against Hitler and Mussolini, and the right was saying we don't even want to do that. But what's striking now is, at least, and this is a movement in a positive direction, there's almost a universal bipartisan support within the United States for the economic sanctions and punishing sanctions. That's not even in the realm of debate, it seems like. It's like, we're just going to do that. And so Americans in the 1939 were not even unified around the idea of sanctions in the way that we are now. So, and that's a good thing.
Chris, a theme that kind of was flowing through your discussion was this concept of toxic masculinity. So, A, would you say a little bit more about that? And B, and I know I keep bringing up the lecture on Thursday, but Riane Eisler really feels that this toxic masculinity is really at the heart of the problem, and that really we have to, quote unquote, attack it through families, through education, through psychoeducation. And so I'm wondering what you think about that.
I totally agree. I mean, if we're going to look at kind of white nationalist movements, I started to see masculinity as central to it as race. As an even more reliable indicator of a kind of a fascist sensibility. And you see this, if you look beyond the boundaries of kind of Europe, there's fascist movements, thriving ones. There was one, obviously in Japan historically, but also India, and the Philippines. And what unites all of these kind of fascist currents is not so much white supremacy, obviously, but it is a certain idea of manhood that's based around kind of action, a hierarchy, diminution of the feminine, but action first of all, kind of a lack of empathy, kind of warrior spirit. That is much more a kind of a reliable global indicator of fascism, even than white supremacy. Right? Even though fascism is always xenophobic or ethnocentric in some level or another, but that masculinity is always there. And that's, I didn't mean to be doing a cheap shot by doing the kind of the Putin Mussolini shirtless thing, but sadly, that is a pretty good indicator, right? You have a leader that's just posing with guns and taking their shirts off. Be afraid, or at least not be afraid, but don't be paralyzed, but take action, right?
How real do you think the nuclear threat is?
I'm strangely, I'm not that, I don't know why. Maybe I'm just ignorant. I'm not that worried about that. I just don't see us going there. You know, and I don't mean to be, you know, downplaying this, but I just, there has been some talk about Putin's possible use of very small nuclear weapons, and that's horrifying, and that's possible. I just don't see a nuclear war global out of this. And again, this is beyond my era of expertise. That's just my kind of personal opinion. So.
Well, I think unless there's anybody else who has any questions, final question, speak now. Chris, I have to tell you, you're just amazing. I mean, seriously, you are amazing. You're clear, you're brilliant. You are just, you are really, this was a gift to us because things have been so confusing and so overwhelming. And
I just
you
want to
brought
say
so much
thank
joy.
you very much. Thank
Yeah.
you so much.
Thank you
Yeah,
so
well,
much for having me, and thank you for the really kind words.
Yeah, you're really, and again, I just want to tell you that Chris volunteers to do this, and this is about the I don't know, the third, fourth, or fifth lecture he's done for us, and you're really, we are so grateful to you. Everybody, thank you for coming. Thank you
Donna,
for
there's
thinking about this with us.
one more question.
Oh, you have a question? Okay, Ilya.
Nope, it's in the chat.
Oh,
Joanne
okay.
Alvarado.
Oh, okay.
The price that Zelensky is receiving, adding.
In the way, do you think the praise that Zelensky is receiving, adding fuel to Putin's toxic masculinity as Zelensky is becoming everything he wanted? That's interesting.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I'm not saying it at that level. I'm not saying like kind of an equivalence between Zelensky and Putin here. But yeah, no, I have a friend who has also written about this, that about in terms of Jewish identity, basically, that Zelensky's kind of remasculinization of Jewishness is also not helpful, right? But I wouldn't say that. I would say yes, but I would not say to the extent that I would make an equivalence. But yeah.
It is interesting that the two heroes in the last 2 months have been the rabbi, right, in the synagogue where the guy, you know, the terrorist was, and Zelensky, to you know, the kind of the opposite of toxic masculinity. And I think that's kind of interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, the opposite of all these guys. So once again, everybody, thank you for coming. Chris, blessings to you. Everybody, stay safe, and I hope we'll see you on Thursday night for more discussion. Good care. Thanks again.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.